Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today we're going back to 1839 to Charleston, where a powerful plantation widow named Ortega shocked society by secretly becoming pregnant 3 times by the same enslaved man. Her story was buried for generations, full of contradictions, power, silence, and an impossible secret no one ever dared to tell. This is a difficult and intense story. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The first time Ellena Ortega held her own secret in her arms, she understood that some truths are heavier than any lie. The baby was born in the back room of the main house on a September night in 1839, when the Carolina heat still clung to everything like a second skin. The midwife was a slave woman named Hattie, who had delivered more than 200 children on plantations across the Low Country. Hattie had seen everything. She had seen babies born dead. She had seen babies sold before their mothers could name them. She had seen babies with skin too light to explain, but she had never seen a white widow cry the way Ellena cried that night, not from pain, from something else entirely, from the weight of what she had done and what she could never undo. The child was a girl. She had her father's eyes. And her father was not the man buried in the family cemetery behind the magnolia trees. Her father was in the slave quarters 300 yards from the main house, waiting in the dark for news he would never be allowed to hear directly. This is the story of Magnolia Grove Plantation. This is the story of Ellena Ortega and Samuel. This is the story of 3 children who should never have existed according to the laws of South Carolina in 1839. And this is the story of how love and survival became the same thing in a world designed to keep them apart. Charleston in 1839 was the wealthiest city in the American South. The harbor brought ships from Europe and the Caribbean, loaded with goods that plantation owners exchanged for cotton and rice. The streets were lined with elegant townhouses painted in soft pastels. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like curtains in a cathedral. Society balls happened every season. Young women in silk dresses danced with young men in tailored coats, while servants in white gloves poured champagne. Everything looked beautiful from the outside. Everything was designed to look beautiful from the outside. But the economy of Charleston ran on human trafficking. By 1839, South Carolina had been a slave state for over 170 years. The city had one of the largest slave markets in North America. Ryan's Mart on Charmer Street sold human beings every week. Families were separated. Children were taken from mothers. Husbands were sold away from wives. The average price for a healthy adult male slave in Charleston that year was approximately $1,200. A skilled blacksmith or carpenter could sell for as much as $2,000. Women of childbearing age were valued for their ability to produce more property for their owners. This was the foundation of everything. This was the world Ellena Ortega inherited when her husband died. Cornelius Ortega was a cruel man. This was not something Ellena discovered after she married him. She knew it before the wedding. Her father knew it. Her mother knew it. Everyone in Charleston society knew that Cornelius Ortega had a temper that could turn a dinner party into a disaster and a plantation into a place of terror. He had inherited Magnolia Grove from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had purchased the land in 1762 and built the original house with timber cut by enslaved hands. The Ortega family was not originally from Charleston. They were Spanish from a merchant family that had made its fortune in Cuba before relocating to South Carolina. This gave them a complicated status in Charleston society. They were wealthy enough to be accepted. They were foreign enough to be watched. Ellena married Cornelius in 1831 when she was 26 years old. This was considered late for a woman of her social class. Most women in Charleston married by 20, some married as young as 16. Ellena had refused 3 proposals before accepting Cornelius. She had believed foolishly that she could manage him, that her intelligence and patience could soften his edges, that the cruelty he showed to others would not extend to her. She was wrong about everything. The first time Cornelius hit her was 3 months after the wedding. They were arguing about household expenses. She had questioned a purchase he made. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand and told her never to question him again. She had questioned a purchase he made. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand and told her never to question him again. She did not question him again, not out loud. But something changed in Ellena that day. Something hardened. She learned to watch. She learned to wait. She learned that survival sometimes means becoming invisible inside your own home. Cornelius was worse with the slaves than he was with her. Much worse. He kept a whip in his study. He used it personally, which was unusual for plantation owners of his status. Reminded the slaves who owned them. He said it reminded the slaves who owned them. He said it maintained proper order. What it actually maintained was an atmosphere of constant terror. The slaves at Magnolia Grove walked carefully. They spoke quietly. They learned to read his moods from the sound of his boots on the porch. Heavy steps meant danger. Light steps meant he was distracted. Silence meant he was hunting for someone to blame. Samuel arrived at Magnolia Grove in 1835. He was 24 years old when he was purchased at auction in Charleston. He had been sold away from a plantation in Virginia after the owner died and the estate was liquidated. This was common. When a planter died, the slaves were often sold to pay debts or divided among heirs. Families that had been together for generations were scattered across the South in a single afternoon. Samuel had lost his mother and 2 sisters that way. He never saw them again. He never knew what happened to them. He carried that absence with him like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life. Cornelius bought Samuel because he needed a blacksmith. The previous blacksmith at Magnolia Grove had died from a fever that swept through the slave quarters in the summer of 1834. Fevers were common on low-country plantations. The swampy terrain bred mosquitoes that carried diseases white doctors could not explain, and slave healers could not cure. Samuel was strong. He was skilled. He had learned blacksmithing from his father on the Virginia plantation. He could make horseshoes, repair tools, forge iron gates, fix wagon wheels. He was worth $1,500 at auction. Cornelius paid it without hesitating. Samuel was different from the other slaves at Magnolia Grove, and everyone noticed. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed impossible under the circumstances. He did not shuffle when he walked. He did not drop his eyes when white people passed. He looked at the world directly, carefully, as if he was memorizing everything for some future purpose. This made Cornelius nervous. He did not like slaves who looked him in the eye. He tried to break Samuel's spirit during the first year. He found reasons to punish him. He assigned him extra work. He withheld food rations. Nothing worked. Samuel endured everything without losing whatever it was that made him different. Eventually, Cornelius gave up. He needed a blacksmith more than he needed submission. He left Samuel alone as long as the work was done. Ellena first noticed Samuel in the spring of 1836. She was walking through the workyard on her way to the kitchen garden when she heard the rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil. She stopped to watch. Samuel was shaping a piece of iron, bending it into a hinge for one of the barn doors. The muscles in his arms moved with precision. His face was focused, concentrated, almost peaceful. Ellena had never seen anyone look peaceful at Magnolia Grove. She stood there longer than she should have. When Samuel looked up and saw her watching, he did not look away. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before returning to his work. 2 seconds. It was nothing. It was everything. Ellena felt her face flush. She hurried to the garden and spent the next hour trying to understand what had just happened. Nothing happened between them for almost 2 years. This is important to understand. Ellena was not a woman who acted impulsively. She was not a woman who broke rules without understanding the consequences. She watched Samuel from a distance. She found excuses to walk through the workyard. She asked the house slaves questions about him casually, carefully. She learned that he could read. This was illegal in South Carolina. Teaching a slave to read had been a criminal offense since 1740. The punishment was a fine for white people and severe whipping for slaves. But someone in Virginia had taught Samuel anyway. His father, people said his father had learned from a sympathetic white minister decades earlier and had passed the knowledge down in secret. Samuel never spoke of it. He never let anyone see him reading, but the other slaves knew. They knew everything about each other. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Cornelius died in December 1837. He was thrown from his horse during a hunting trip and broke his neck. The death was instant. Some people said it was an accident. Some people whispered that the horse had been spooked deliberately. No one investigated. No one wanted to investigate. The slaves at Magnolia Grove were careful not to show their relief. They kept their faces blank during the funeral. They stood in rows at the edge of the cemetery while the minister spoke about Cornelius Ortega's Christian virtues and his devotion to his family. Ellena stood at the grave in her black dress and black veil and felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, Just emptiness. Just the strange sensation of being suddenly untethered from a life she had never chosen. The will was read the following week. Cornelius had no children. His nearest male relatives were cousins in Cuba who showed no interest in managing a Carolina plantation. Everything went to Ellena. The house, the land, the cotton crop, the slaves. 214 human beings became her legal property on a cold December afternoon. She was 32 years old. She was alone, and she was one of the wealthiest women in Charleston. Charleston society did not know what to do with Ellena Ortega. Widows were supposed to remarry. Widows were supposed to find a man to manage their affairs. Widows were not supposed to announce that they intended to run a plantation themselves. But Ellena did exactly that. She met with lawyers. She met with cotton factors. She reviewed the account books that Cornelius had kept locked in his study. She discovered that Magnolia Grove was in better financial condition than she had expected. Cornelius had been cruel, but he had not been stupid. The plantation produced over 200 bales of cotton per year. The rice fields added additional income. If she managed carefully, she could maintain everything without a husband. The first year was difficult. Overseers tried to cheat her. Neighbors tried to pressure her into selling. Men she barely knew proposed marriage with transparent motives. Eleanor refused everyone and everything. She hired a new overseer named Thomas Garrett, a man who came recommended by a Quaker family she had met in Philadelphia years earlier. Garrett was unusual for a Southern overseer. He did not use the whip. He did not believe in torture as motivation. He managed the slaves through a system of incentives and fair treatment that other plantation owners considered dangerously soft. Production at Magnolia Grove did not decrease. It actually increased. Ellena did not care about the opinions of other plantation owners. Samuel watched all of this. He watched Ellena transform from a silent wife into something else entirely. He watched her ride out to inspect the fields in the morning. He watched her meet with the cotton factors when they came from Charleston. He watched her walk through the slave quarters on Sunday evenings, asking questions about sick children and damaged cabins. No owner had ever done that before. No owner had ever seemed to care. Samuel was careful not to let his watching become obvious. He was careful not to let anyone see the respect that was growing in him. Respect was dangerous. Respect could turn into something else, something that could destroy both of them. The first time they spoke was in March 1838. A late frost had killed some of the early cotton plants, and Ellena was walking through the fields to assess the damage. Samuel was there repairing a broken plow that had been left near the edge of the field. She stopped beside him without planning to stop. She asked about the plow. He explained the problem. The conversation was ordinary. The conversation was about nothing. But it lasted 10 minutes, then 15, then 20. They talked about the weather. They talked about the soil. They talked about a book she had seen in the Charleston library. Samuel was careful. He did not reveal that he could read. He did not reveal anything that could be used against him. But he let her see his intelligence. He let her see that there was a mind behind his careful silence. Eleanor went back to the main house that evening and could not sleep. After that, they found excuses. She needed ironwork for the garden gate. He delivered it personally. She wanted a new set of hooks for the kitchen. He measured the space himself. Each interaction was brief. Each interaction was proper. Each interaction left them both more aware of what was building between them. This was 1838 in South Carolina. A white woman and a black man could not simply fall in love. They could not court. They could not write letters. They could not walk together in public. Everything had to be hidden. Everything had to be coded. Everything had to be deniable. The first time they touched was in June 1838. Ellena had gone to the blacksmith shed after dark to discuss an order for new horseshoes. This was the excuse. This was what anyone watching would have believed. Samuel was alone. The fire in the forge had burned down to coals. The shed was lit only by the orange glow of dying embers. Ellena asked about the horseshoes. Samuel answered. Then there was silence. A long silence. A silence that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She reached out and touched his hand. That was all. Just her fingertips against his knuckles. Just 5 seconds of contact in the darkness. Samuel did not pull away. He did not speak. He looked at her with those eyes that had memorized everything since the day he arrived at Magnolia Grove. He looked at her and she understood that he had been waiting too. that he had been watching too, that this impossible thing had been growing in both of them since that first moment in the workyard 2 years before. What happened after that night cannot be described as romance in any traditional sense. There was no courtship, there were no flowers or poetry or promises of forever. There was only need. There was only two people reaching toward each other across an abyss that their world had created. Ellena knew the risks. She knew that she could lose everything. She knew that Samuel could lose his life. In South Carolina in 1838, a sexual relationship between a white woman and a black man was not just scandalous, it was criminal. The woman faced social destruction. The man faced death. These were the stakes. They both understood the stakes. They were careful, more careful than seemed humanly possible. They met only after dark. They met only when the household was asleep. They met only in places where they could not be observed. The blacksmith shed, the far edge of the tobacco barn, a storage room beneath the main house that had not been used in years. Samuel always left before dawn. Ellena always checked to make sure no one had seen. They developed signals. A candle in a certain window meant it was safe. A specific arrangement of tools on the workbench meant danger. They lived in constant awareness of discovery. They lived in constant fear. And somehow within that fear, something else survived. Something that neither of them could name. Something that felt like being seen for the first time in their lives. By October 1838, Ellena knew she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses for 2 months. She had begun to feel nauseous in the mornings. She had seen enough pregnant women, both in society and in the slave quarters, to recognize the signs. She told Samuel on a Thursday night in the blacksmith shed. She watched his face in the dim light as he absorbed the news. She expected fear. She expected panic. What she saw instead was something like wonder. Something like grief. Something like both at the same time. A child. Their child. A child who would be born into a legal impossibility. Under South Carolina law, the child of an enslaved woman was automatically a slave regardless of the father's status. But the child of a free white woman was automatically free regardless of the father's status. This meant that Eleanor's child would be born free, legally free. But socially, the child would be an abomination, a scandal, evidence of a crime that could not be forgiven. If anyone discovered the truth about the child's father, Ellena would be destroyed. Samuel would be killed. The child would be taken away and raised in shame. Ellena began to plan. She had always been good at planning. She had survived 8 years with Cornelius Ortega by planning every word, every gesture, every moment of every day. Now she applied the same discipline to this new problem. She needed to hide the pregnancy for as long as possible. She needed to explain the child when it came. She needed a story that would satisfy the neighbors and the authorities and everyone who would be watching. The story she created was simple. She told people that she had been corresponding with a cousin in Savannah, a male cousin. She implied that there had been a secret engagement before Cornelius died. She suggested that they had married quietly during a visit she made to Georgia in the spring. She produced forged letters. She created a fictional husband named David Cortez, who had tragically died of yellow fever just weeks after their wedding. She was a widow twice now, a widow carrying her dead husband's child. It was a sad story. It was a believable story. Charleston society accepted it because they wanted to believe it. The alternative was unthinkable. Hattie was the only person who knew the truth. Hattie had been at Magnolia Grove for 40 years. She had been born on the plantation and would die on the plantation. She had raised Eleanor's husband when he was a child. She had treated Ellena's bruises after Cornelius hit her. She had watched everything and said nothing and kept secrets that could have destroyed families. When Ellena asked Hattie to help with the birth, Hattie understood immediately. She did not ask questions. She did not judge. She simply nodded and began preparing the back room where the baby would be delivered away from curious eyes. The baby was born on September 14th, 1839. A girl, 7 pounds, healthy, perfect. She had brown skin, not dark, not light, a color that could be explained by Spanish ancestry if no one looked too closely. She had her father's eyes deep brown, intelligent, already watching the world with that same careful attention that Samuel had. Eleanor named her Josephine. She told everyone that the child took after her father's Cuban relatives. People accepted this. People wanted to accept this. The truth was too terrible to contemplate. Samuel saw his daughter for the first time when she was 3 days old. Ellena brought the baby to the blacksmith shed at midnight. She watched Samuel hold the tiny bundle in his massive arms. She watched the tears roll down his face. Tears he could not shed in daylight. Tears he could not explain to anyone. This was his child, his blood, his future. And he would never be able to claim her. He would never be able to hold her in public. He would never be able to call her daughter. She would grow up in the main house with white linens and music lessons and everything that enslaved children could never have. And he would watch from a distance pretending she was nothing to him. This is what slavery did. This is what the system created, not just chains and whips and forced labor, but the destruction of families, the denial of parenthood, the transformation of love into something that had to be hidden and coded and denied. Samuel understood this better than Eleanor ever could. He had lived it his entire life. He had lost his mother and his sisters to the slave market. He had watched families torn apart at auction while white men counted money, and now he had a daughter he could never acknowledge, a daughter who would be raised to see him as property, a daughter who might never know who he really was. The next 2 years were the strangest of Ellena's life. She was a mother and a plantation owner and a woman living a complete lie. She raised Josephine in the main house with the help of a wet nurse and the constant supervision of Hattie. She continued to manage Magnolia Grove with the efficiency that had surprised everyone. She maintained her social position in Charleston. She attended church. She went to occasional parties. She wore the correct dresses and said the correct things and smiled at the correct people. And at night, when the house was quiet, she went to Samuel. She went to him because she could not stop, because what was between them had grown beyond reason or caution or self-preservation, because he was the only person who knew who she really was. She became pregnant again in the winter of 1840. This time, there was no new fictional husband to explain the child. This time, she had to rely entirely on the story of the Spanish cousin who had died. She told people that she had been pregnant when David died, that she had not known, that the grief had delayed her recognition of the symptoms. It was a thin story. Some people had doubts. Ellena did not care about their doubts. She cared about survival. She cared about protecting her children. She cared about the secret that could destroy everything. The second child was a boy born in August 1841. She named him Thomas after the overseer who had been loyal to her. Thomas Garrett understood what was happening. He had to understand, but he never said a word. He was a quiet abolitionist who had come south out of some complicated sense of mission. He believed slavery was a sin. He believed the system would eventually collapse under the weight of its own evil. In the meantime, he did what he could to ease the suffering of the people under his supervision. He looked the other way when Ellena walked to the blacksmith shed after dark. He pretended not to notice when the children's features became harder to explain. He was complicit in the lie because the lie was the only thing keeping everyone alive. Josephine was 2 years old when her brother was born. She was already beautiful. She was already smart. She had started speaking early, mixing English with the fragments of Spanish that Ellena taught her. She called Ellena Mama and reached for her with tiny hands every time she entered the room. She did not know that the man who made horseshoes in the workyard was her father. She did not know why Mama sometimes cried when she looked at her. She did not know anything except that she was loved. That was enough for now. That was enough. Samuel met his son for the first time in the tobacco barn. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The plantation was silent except for the summer insects singing in the darkness. Samuel held the baby boy and felt something crack open inside him. 2 children now. 2 children he had brought into a world that would never let them be his. He looked at Eleanor in the darkness and asked the question he had been afraid to ask. What happens when they grow up? What happens when they start to understand? What happens when someone figures out the truth? Eleanor did not have answers. She had plans. She had strategies. She had money hidden away in a Charleston bank under a false name. She had contacts in Philadelphia and Boston who might help if everything fell apart. She had maps of the routes north that escaped slaves used to reach freedom. She was preparing for a future she could not imagine. She was preparing for disaster, but she did not have answers. Not real answers. Not the kind of answers that could make any of this make sense. The truth is that she had stopped trying to make sense of it. She had stopped asking herself how she had ended up here. A widow from a respected family, a plantation owner, a woman who had been raised to believe in the social order, a woman who now lived a daily betrayal of everything that social order demanded. She loved a man she was supposed to see as property. She had children she could never explain. She was trapped in a cage of her own construction, and she could not imagine any way out that did not involve destruction. But she also could not imagine stopping. She could not imagine going back to the loneliness of her marriage. She could not imagine pretending that Samuel was just a blacksmith and her children were just the offspring of a fictional dead husband. The lie had become more real than the truth. The secret had become more authentic than the public performance. When she was with Samuel, when they talked in the darkness about books and ideas and the future they could never have, she felt more herself than she had ever felt in the drawing rooms of Charleston society. This is the paradox that slavery created. It destroyed families and created new ones in the shadows. It enforced brutal hierarchies and generated secret intimacies that defied those hierarchies. It made monsters of ordinary people and revealed the humanity of people who were denied their humanity. Ellena was not innocent. She owned human beings. She benefited from their unpaid labor. She was part of the system even as she broke its rules. Samuel was not simply a victim. He made choices. He took risks. He reached towards something that could have cost him his life. They were both complicit in the horror of their world. They were both trying to find something human within that horror. The summer of 1842 brought changes to Magnolia Grove. The cotton market had fluctuated, and several neighboring plantations were struggling. Eleanor had managed her finances well enough to remain stable, but the pressure from creditors and competitors increased. Several Charleston families who had looked down on her as a woman managing alone now came to her for advice. She gave it carefully, revealing nothing about herself, maintaining the mask that protected her and her children. Josephine was nearly 3 years old. Thomas was almost 1. They lived in the main house as Ellena's legitimate children. They had a nursery with white curtains and wooden toys carved by one of the slaves. They had clothes made by the seamstresses in Charleston. They had everything that wealthy children had, except the truth about who they were, except a father who could hold them openly, except a life without the constant shadow of potential discovery. Samuel continued his work as a blacksmith. He was essential to the plantation now. His skills had expanded beyond horseshoes and hinges. He repaired the cotton gin when it broke down. He built a new irrigation system for the rice fields. He designed tools that made the work more efficient. Eleanor paid him nothing for this. Of course, slaves could not be paid, but she found ways to improve his conditions: better food, a larger cabin, medical care when he was injured. These small mercies were the only currency she had. These small mercies were the only way she could acknowledge what he meant to her without saying it out loud. The danger grew as the children grew. Josephine's skin was light enough to pass inspection from casual observers, but Thomas was darker. His features were stronger. As he got older, it would become harder to explain him as the child of a Spanish cousin. Eleanor began to consider options she had never considered before. She began to think about leaving Charleston. She began to think about the North. She began to think about what it would mean to give up everything she had ever known in order to protect the people she loved. She wrote letters to contacts in Philadelphia. Careful letters, coded letters. She inquired about the community of free blacks in the city. She asked about schools that accepted children of mixed race. She asked about the legal status of former slaves who reached the North. The answers she received were complicated. Pennsylvania was a free state, but prejudice existed everywhere. Mixed-race children faced discrimination from both white and black communities. There were no easy answers. There was no place where her family would simply be accepted. But there might be places where they could survive. There might be places where the truth would not mean death. Samuel listened to her plans without hope. He had seen too many escape attempts fail. He had seen too many people caught and returned and punished. The Fugitive Slave Act made it dangerous even in the North. Slave catchers operated in Philadelphia and Boston. Freedom was never guaranteed, but he also understood that staying was becoming impossible. The children were getting older. The questions would come. Someone would see what should not be seen. Someone would say what should not be said. The secret could not last forever. Nothing could last forever. In the fall of 1842, Ellena discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She stood in her bedroom looking at herself in the mirror and felt the weight of what she had done and what she would continue to do. 3 children, 3 impossible children, 3 reasons to keep living, and 3 reasons to fear that she could not protect any of them. She had built a castle of lies around herself. She had furnished it with stories and documents and performances convincing enough to fool everyone who wanted to be fooled. But the foundation was sand. One strong wind could collapse everything. She did not tell Samuel immediately. She waited until she was certain. She waited until she could see the slight curve of her belly in the candlelight. Then she went to him in the blacksmith shed on a December night when the stars were sharp and cold above the Carolina pines. She told him. She watched his face. She saw the same mixture of wonder and grief that she had seen twice before. Another child, another secret, another piece of their hearts that would have to be hidden from the world. They held each other in the darkness. They did not speak of the future. They did not make plans. They simply existed together in that moment. Two people who had found each other across an impossible divide. Outside, the plantation slept. The slaves in their quarters, the overseer in his cottage, the children in the main house, everyone dreaming their separate dreams, everyone unaware that the center of Magnolia Grove was this small shed where a white woman and a black man clung to each other in defiance of everything their world believed. The winter passed slowly. Eleanor managed the plantation through the cold months, planning for the spring planting, reviewing accounts, maintaining the appearance of a respectable widow, raising her children alone. Her pregnancy was not yet visible beneath the layers of winter clothing. She had time, not much time, but enough to prepare another story, enough to arrange another performance, enough to create another fiction that would protect the truth. But something else was building at Magnolia Grove, something Eleanor did not see, something that moved through the slave quarters in whispers and glances. The overseer, Thomas Garrett, had hired an assistant for the spring planting season, a man named Marcus Webb. Webb was different from Garrett. Webb was harder. Webb had worked on plantations in Mississippi and Alabama, where discipline was maintained through terror. He did not understand Garrett's gentle methods. He did not approve of the relative freedom the slaves at Magnolia Grove enjoyed. And he had sharp eyes, eyes that noticed things other people missed. Marcus Webb noticed that the blacksmith worked unusual hours. He noticed that the mistress of the house took walks after dark. He noticed the children who did not quite look like the Spanish portrait hanging in the parlor. He noticed everything, and he began to put the pieces together. He began to understand the secret that Ellena had protected for almost 4 years. He did not say anything. Not yet. He waited. He watched. He gathered his evidence, because Marcus Webb understood something that Ellena had forgotten. Secrets have value, and in the South in 1842, the right secret could make a man's fortune. The spring came early that year. The magnolia bloomed in March. The cotton went into the ground by the 1st of April. Ellena's pregnancy became visible, and she deployed her prepared story. Another child from her tragically dead husband. A final gift from a love cut short by yellow fever. The neighbors nodded sympathetically. Some of them had doubts, more doubts than before, but no one spoke them aloud. Speaking them aloud would have meant confronting something too terrible to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb wrote a letter. He wrote it on a Sunday afternoon when the plantation was quiet with the enforced rest that Southern law required for slaves. He wrote it carefully in the plain handwriting of a man who had not received much education. He addressed it to Ellena's closest neighbors, the Hendersons, whose plantation bordered Magnolia Grove to the east. In the letter, he described what he had observed. In the letter, he made accusations that could destroy everything. He did not send the letter immediately. He held it. He calculated. He waited for the right moment to use it because Marcus Webb wanted something. He wanted power. He wanted position. He wanted the life that men like Thomas Garrett took for granted. And he believed that Ellena Ortega's secret was his path to getting everything he wanted. Eleanor did not know about the letter. She did not know that her careful world was about to collapse. She continued through the spring of 1843, managing her plantation, raising her children, visiting Samuel in the darkness. She felt the new baby growing inside her. She made plans for the birth. She arranged for Hattie to attend her again. She prepared the back room where Josephine and Thomas had been born. She believed that she could continue. She believed that her lies were strong enough. She believed that love could survive anything. She was about to discover how wrong she was. This is the end of part 1. The story continues with the arrival of crisis at Magnolia Grove, the betrayal that would threaten everyone Eleanor loved, and the desperate choices that would determine whether any of them survived. The letter arrived at the Henderson plantation on a Tuesday morning in late April 1843. Margaret Henderson was having breakfast with her husband Robert when their house servant brought it in on a silver tray. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The paper was cheap. Margaret almost threw it away without reading, but something made her open it. Curiosity, boredom, the particular hunger for scandal that defined Charleston society in those years. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. Then she handed it to her husband without saying a word. Robert Henderson was 62 years old. He had been a plantation owner for 40 years. He had served in the South Carolina legislature. He sat on the board of the Charleston Cotton Exchange. He was a man who understood how the world worked and how it was supposed to work. When he read Marcus Webb's letter, his face turned the color of ash. He sat down his coffee cup with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked at his wife. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The letter accused Ellena Ortega of carrying on a sexual relationship with one of her slaves. It named Samuel the blacksmith specifically. It claimed that her 3 children were not the offspring of a fictional Spanish cousin, but the products of this criminal union. It offered evidence: the timing of the pregnancies, the appearance of the children, the midnight visits to the blacksmith shed. Marcus Webb had been watching for months. Marcus Webb had documented everything, and now Marcus Webb wanted payment for his silence. Robert Henderson did not pay Marcus Webb. Robert Henderson was not that kind of man. Instead, he called for his carriage and rode directly to Charleston. He visited the county sheriff. He visited a judge he had known for 30 years. He visited the office of the Charleston Mercury and spoke with the editor. By sunset, Ellena Ortega's secret was no longer a secret. By sunset, the machinery of Southern justice had begun to move. Ellena learned what had happened the following morning. Thomas Garrett rode up to the main house at dawn with his face gray and his hands shaking. He had heard from a contact in Charleston. He had heard that warrants were being prepared. He had heard that a mob was forming. He told Ellena everything in the parlor while Josephine and Thomas played upstairs, unaware that their world was ending. Ellena listened without crying. She had always known this day might come. She had prepared for it in the back of her mind, even as she refused to believe it would actually happen. She had money. She had contacts. She had plans. But none of her plans had accounted for the speed of what was unfolding. None of her plans had imagined that she would have less than 24 hours to save everyone she loved. She sent Thomas Garrett to warn Samuel. She sent Hattie to pack essential items for the children. She went to her bedroom and opened the hidden compartment in her wardrobe, where she kept documents and cash. She had accumulated almost $3,000 over the past 4 years, enough to buy passage north, enough to start over somewhere else, enough to survive if they could escape before the mob arrived. Samuel received the news in the blacksmith shed. He had been working on a set of hinges for the barn door. Simple work, routine work, the kind of work that let his mind wander to places it should not go. When Thomas Garrett appeared in the doorway with terror in his eyes, Samuel knew immediately. He had always known this moment would come. He had been waiting for it since the first night Ellena touched his hand in the darkness. He set down his hammer. He removed his leather apron. He walked toward the main house for the first time in daylight. The next hours were chaos. Ellena gathered what she could carry. She dressed the children in traveling clothes. She wrote a letter to her lawyer in Charleston transferring ownership of Magnolia Grove to Thomas Garrett with instructions to free all the slaves upon her death or departure. She did not know if the transfer would be honored. She did not know if the law would recognize it, but she had to try. She had to do something for the 200 people whose lives depended on the plantation she was about to abandon. Samuel could not travel with them openly. This was the brutal mathematics of their situation. A white woman traveling with a black man would be stopped at every checkpoint. They would be questioned. They would be detained. Samuel would be arrested and returned to Magnolia Grove to face whatever punishment the county decided to impose. The penalty for a slave who had sexual relations with a white woman was death. Not prison, not whipping, death. Usually by hanging, sometimes by burning. The law was explicit. The law was absolute. The law did not recognize love or consent or humanity. They decided to separate. Eleanor would take the children and travel by carriage toward Columbia. She had a contact there, a woman named Mrs. Peaton, who had abolitionist sympathies and might shelter them while they arranged passage further north. Samuel would travel by foot and by night, following the routes he had memorized from other slaves who had attempted escape. They would reunite in Philadelphia. This was the plan. This was what they told themselves. Neither of them believed it would actually work. The goodbye happened in the back room where their children had been born. Josephine was 3.5 years old. She understood that something was wrong. She clung to her mother's skirt and asked questions that Ellena could not answer. Thomas was almost 2. He did not understand anything except that the adults around him were frightened, and inside Ellena's belly, their third child kicked and turned, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them all. Samuel held his children for what he believed would be the last time. He held Josephine and whispered words in her ear that she would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that she was loved. He told her that she was strong. He told her that no matter what happened, no matter what anyone told her, she should never be ashamed of who she was. Josephine did not understand the words, but she understood the weight behind them. She understood that this man who smelled like iron and fire was somehow important. She would spend years trying to understand why. Ellena and Samuel did not embrace. They could not risk being seen. They stood 3 feet apart in the dim light of that back room and looked at each other with everything they could not say. 4 years. 4 years of stolen moments and impossible love. 4 years of building a family that should not exist. It had all led to this, a hurried goodbye, a desperate plan, and the almost certain knowledge that they would never see each other again. Samuel left first. He slipped out the back of the main house and disappeared into the pine forest that bordered the plantation to the west. He carried nothing except a knife and a small amount of food. He knew the stars. He knew which way was north. He knew that the journey to Philadelphia was over 600 meters through territory filled with people who would kill him on sight if they knew what he had done. He started walking anyway. He had no choice. Staying meant death. Running meant a chance. Even a small chance was better than none. Ellena left an hour later. She loaded the children into the carriage with Hattie, who had refused to stay behind. Hattie was free now, legally free, according to the document Ellena had signed that morning, but freedom meant nothing without somewhere to go. Hattie chose to go with the family she had served her entire life. She chose to protect the children she had helped bring into the world. This was loyalty beyond obligation. This was love in its most practical form. The carriage headed northwest toward Columbia. The roads were rough and the horses were tired, but Ellena pushed them as fast as they could go. She knew the mob would discover her absence soon. She knew they would follow. She had maybe a few hours head start, maybe less. The spring mud slowed the wheels. The children cried. Hattie sang quiet songs to calm them. Ellena sat rigid in her seat and watched the road ahead and prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. They made it 20 meters before the first riders appeared behind them. There were 6 men on horseback. Ellena recognized one of them as a neighbor's son, a young man named William Crawford, who had once asked to court her before she married Cornelius. The others were strangers, hired men, the kind of men who tracked runaway slaves for bounty money. They caught up to the carriage just as the sun was setting. They surrounded it on the narrow road. William Crawford rode up to the window and looked at Ellena with contempt and something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. They did not arrest her immediately. The law regarding white women in these situations was complicated. She had committed a crime, yes, but she was also a widow from a respected family. She was also pregnant. Southern chivalry, such as it was, created hesitation, even in moments of moral outrage. William Crawford demanded that she return to Magnolia Grove to face questioning. He demanded that she surrender the children. He demanded that she tell them where Samuel had gone. Ellena refused. She sat in that carriage with her children and her ancient servant and looked at 6 armed men and refused. She told them she would rather die than let them touch her children. She told them that Samuel was already beyond their reach. She told them that what she had done was not their concern. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She had spent 8 years married to a cruel man. She had learned how to face violence without showing fear. That training saved her life in that moment. William Crawford did not know what to do. He had expected Eleanor to collapse. He had expected tears and confessions and the satisfaction of bringing a fallen woman to justice. He had not expected defiance. He conferred with the other riders. They argued. They disagreed. Some wanted to drag Ellena from the carriage by force. Others worried about the legal consequences of harming a pregnant white woman, even a disgraced one. While they argued, the sun finished setting. Darkness fell over the Carolina road. Hattie used the darkness. She had grown up on a plantation. She knew how to move without being seen. While the men argued 20 feet away, she slipped out the far side of the carriage and disappeared into the trees. She carried Thomas in her arms. Ellena passed Josephine through the window to her. The children were silent. They had learned already that silence meant survival. Hattie vanished into the forest like smoke dissolving in air. When William Crawford finally approached the carriage again, he found only Ellena inside. The children were gone. The old slave woman was gone. He screamed at her. He demanded to know where they had gone. Ellena smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in days. She told him to search the forest if he wanted. She told him that he would never find them. She told him that her children were already free. They took Ellena back to Magnolia Grove. They locked her in her own bedroom. They posted guards at the door. They sent riders in every direction to search for the children, for Hattie, for Samuel. They found nothing. The forest had swallowed everyone Ellena loved. She sat alone in the room where she had planned her escapes, where she had dreamed her impossible dreams, and she waited for whatever came next. The trial happened 3 weeks later in Charleston. It was not really a trial. It was a performance. The outcome had been decided before the first witness spoke. Ellena stood before the judge in a dress that no longer fit properly over her growing belly. She listened to testimony from Marcus Webb, who described in graphic detail what he claimed to have witnessed. She listened to Robert Henderson express his shock and outrage on behalf of civilized society. She listened to a parade of neighbors and acquaintances who had always suspected something was wrong with the Spanish widow and her 2 dark children. She did not defend herself. Her lawyer had advised her to show remorse, to beg for mercy, to claim that she had been seduced or manipulated or forced. Eleanor refused. She stood in that courtroom and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had loved Samuel. She had borne his children. She was not sorry. She would never be sorry. Let them punish her for that if they wanted. She would not pretend to regret the only real thing she had ever done. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in the South Carolina Women's Prison in Columbia. This was considered a lenient sentence. Many in the courtroom had wanted her hanged, but Southern law was reluctant to execute white women, especially pregnant ones. The judge made it clear that Ellena's social status was the only thing saving her life. He made it clear that her children, if found, would be taken from her permanently. He made it clear that she would never be welcome in Charleston society again. Ellena listened to all of it with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the trial. When the guards led her away, she did not look back. The prison in Columbia was a brick building designed to hold approximately 50 women. When Ellena arrived, there were over 80 inmates crowded into cells meant for 2 or 3. Most of the prisoners were there for minor offenses: theft, prostitution, public drunkenness. A few were there for violence. Ellena was the only one there for loving across the color line. The other prisoners did not know how to treat her. Some admired her defiance. Some despised her sin. Most simply avoided her, uncertain which response would bring them the least trouble. Ellena gave birth in the prison infirmary on August 7, 1843. The baby was a boy. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Ellena held him for exactly 6 hours before the prison authorities took him away. They told her he would be placed with a family in Charleston. They told her she would not be given information about where he went. They told her this was the consequence of her choices. Eleanor did not scream. She did not beg. She simply watched them carry her son through the infirmary door and disappeared inside herself to a place where the pain could not reach her. She named him Samuel in her heart. She would never know what name his adoptive family gave him. She would never know if he survived childhood. She would never know if he ever learned the truth about where he came from. This was her punishment. Not the prison walls, not the hard labor, not the years of her life taken away. The punishment was not knowing. The punishment was imagining 1,000 different futures for her child and never learning which one was real. Meanwhile, somewhere in the forests of North Carolina, Hattie walked north with 2 children clinging to her skirts. She traveled by night and hid by day. She begged food from slave quarters on plantations she passed. She followed the stars and the whispered directions of strangers who recognized what she was doing. The Underground Railroad was not a formal organization in 1843. It was a network of sympathetic individuals, some black and some white, who risked their lives to help escaped slaves reach freedom. Hattie was not a slave anymore, but Josephine and Thomas was something more complicated, something the law had no category for. She protected them anyway. They reached Philadelphia in October 1843, after 5 months of traveling. They arrived at the door of a Quaker family named the Motts who had been expecting them. Eleanor had written to Lucretia Mott years earlier, establishing a connection that now proved essential. The Motts took in Hattie and the children without hesitation. They provided food and shelter and new identities. Josephine became Josephine Freeman. Thomas became Thomas Freeman. The name was intentional. The name was a statement. Whatever they had been in the South, here they were free. Samuel arrived in Philadelphia 2 weeks later. He had traveled over 600 meters in 6 months. He had nearly died 3 times. He had been shot at in Virginia. He had almost drowned crossing the Potomac. He had spent 2 weeks hiding in a barn in Maryland while slave catchers searched the surrounding area. But he had made it against all probability. Against all reason, he had made it. When he walked through the door of the M household and saw his children playing in the parlor, he fell to his knees and wept. The reunion was not what any of them had imagined. Samuel was gaunt from the journey, barely recognizable as the strong man who had worked the forge at Magnolia Grove. Josephine did not remember him. Thomas had been too young to remember anything. They looked at this stranger their Aunt Hattie embraced and did not understand who he was. Samuel had to introduce himself to his own children. He had to earn their trust like any other stranger. This was another cruelty of the system that had separated them. Even after escape, the damage continued. Samuel found work in Philadelphia as a blacksmith. His skills were valued in the North just as they had been in the South. The difference was that now he earned wages. Now he could rent a small house for his family. Now he could walk down the street without looking over his shoulder for patrollers. The fear never completely disappeared. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that he could be captured and returned to South Carolina at any time. But each day that passed made that possibility a little more remote. Each day that passed made freedom a little more real. Josephine and Thomas grew up in Philadelphia knowing part of the truth about their origins. Samuel told them what he could. Hattie filled in what he left out. They learned that their mother was a white woman in a southern prison. They learned that they had a baby brother somewhere who they might never meet. They learned that their family had been torn apart by laws designed to keep people like them from existing. They learned to be proud of their survival even as they grieved for what they had lost. Ellena served 3 years of her 5-year sentence. She was released early in 1846 due to good behavior and overcrowding in the prison. She emerged into a world that no longer had a place for her. Magnolia Grove had been sold to pay her legal debts. Her family in Charleston refused to acknowledge her. The social position she had once occupied no longer existed. She was 39 years old, penniless, and completely alone. She made her way north. It took her almost a year, working domestic jobs in cities along the way, saving every penny she could. She arrived in Philadelphia in the spring of 1847. She found the Mott household. She asked about her children. Lucretia Mott looked at this haggarded woman on her doorstep and did something remarkable. She told the truth. She gave Eleanor the address where Samuel and the children were living. She warned her that the reunion might be difficult. Then she embraced Ellena and welcomed her to freedom. The meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon in April 1847. Ellena walked up the steps of a modest row house in a neighborhood of free blacks and recent immigrants. She knocked on the door. Samuel opened it. They stood there looking at each other for a long moment. 4 years had passed since their desperate goodbye at Magnolia Grove. They had both aged. They had both suffered. They had both survived. Samuel stepped aside and let her enter. Josephine was 7 years old now. She had grown tall and serious. She looked at Ellena with her father's eyes and did not recognize her. Thomas was 5. He hid behind his sister and peeked out at the strange white woman who had entered their house. Ellena knelt down to their level. She did not cry, though she wanted to. She introduced herself carefully, the way Samuel had introduced himself years earlier. She told them she was their mother. She told them she had been away, but she was back now. She told them she would never leave them again. The children did not run to her arms. They did not call her mother. They stood with their father and their Aunt Hattie and regarded her with the caution of people who had learned not to trust easily. This was fair. This was reasonable. Ellena had disappeared from their lives when they were babies. She was a story they had been told, not a person they remembered. Building a relationship would take time. Building trust would take years. Ellena was prepared to wait. She had waited this long. She could wait longer. Samuel and Ellena did not marry. They could not marry. Interracial marriage was illegal in Pennsylvania in 1847. It would remain illegal until 1870, but they lived together as a family. They shared the small row house with their children and Hattie, who refused to live anywhere else. Samuel worked his forge. Ellena took in sewing and later found work teaching at a school for black children. They were poor by the standards of the society they had left. They were rich by the standards of what they had survived. The third child, the son Ellena had named Samuel in her heart, was never found. Ellena searched for years. She wrote letters to contacts in Charleston. She hired investigators when she could afford them. She followed every rumor and every lead. Nothing ever came of it. The boy had disappeared into the system of Southern families who adopted children of unclear origins. He might have grown up wealthy. He might have grown up poor. He might have died young. Eleanor would never know. She carried that absence with her like Samuel had carried the absence of his mother and sisters. Some losses never heal. Some questions never get answered. Josephine grew into a remarkable woman. She inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's quiet dignity. She attended school, then became a teacher herself, then became an activist in the growing movement for abolition and women's rights. She spoke at meetings and wrote pamphlets and organized protests. She told her story to anyone who would listen. She became living proof that the boundaries the South had drawn between races were arbitrary and cruel and ultimately meaningless. In 1858, she married a free black man named James Wilson, and they had 4 children who grew up knowing exactly who they were and where they came from. Thomas followed a different path. He became a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He preached sermons about justice and redemption and the complicated nature of love. He traveled throughout the North speaking about his experiences, using his own family as evidence of slavery's absurdity. How could a system that classified him as property because of his father's blood ignore the fact that his mother's blood made him free? How could the law recognize Ellela's ownership of Samuel while refusing to recognize their love? Thomas asked these questions from pulpits across Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts. He did not have answers, but he believed the questions themselves had power. Samuel died in 1862, just as the Civil War was beginning to turn against the South. He was 51 years old. His heart gave out on an ordinary Tuesday while he was working at his forge. Ellena found him on the floor of the workshop, still holding his hammer, as if he had simply paused in the middle of a task. She sat beside him for an hour before she called for help. She talked to him in the quiet way they had always talked in the darkness of the blacksmith shed at Magnolia Grove. She told him she loved him. She told him she had always loved him. She told him their children were safe and free and would stay that way forever. Ellena lived another 20 years. She saw the end of the Civil War. She saw the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. She saw the brief hope of Reconstruction and the terrible betrayal that followed. She watched the country that had tried to destroy her family struggle to understand what it had done and what it owed to the people it had wronged. She never returned to South Carolina. She never wanted to see Magnolia Grove again, but she followed the news from Charleston with careful attention. She learned that Thomas Garrett had freed all the slaves on the plantation as she had instructed. She learned that many of them had stayed on as free workers, building new lives on the land where they had been held captive. She died in 1882 at the age of 75. Josephine and Thomas were at her bedside, so were her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. 4 generations of the family that should not have existed according to the laws of South Carolina in 1839. Ellena looked at them gathered around her bed and felt something she had not expected to feel. Peace. After everything. After the hiding and the fear and the prison and the loss. After the years of struggle and the weight of secrets, peace. She had done something impossible. She had loved against the rules. She had created life against the law. And here was the result. Here were her children and their children, and the future spreading out ahead of them like a road with no end. Her last words were to Josephine. She whispered them so quietly that Josephine had to lean close to hear. She said, "Tell them the truth. Always tell them the truth. They need to know where they came from so they know who they can become." Josephine did tell the truth. She wrote it all down in a memoir that was published in 1885, 3 years after her mother's death. The book was called Children of Two Worlds, A Family's Journey from Slavery to Freedom. It told the whole story. Ellena and Samuel, the 3 pregnancies, the midnight meetings in the blacksmith shed, the betrayal and the escape, and the years of separation, everything. Josephine did not hide anything. She did not soften the edges. She wrote it exactly as it had happened because she understood that the truth was the only thing that could not be taken away. The book found readers throughout the North. It was discussed in abolitionist circles and women's rights meetings. It was cited in debates about race and family and the legacy of slavery. It became, in its small way, part of the historical record, evidence that the boundaries between black and white were never as fixed as the law pretended. Evidence that human beings had always found ways to reach across the divides that society created. Evidence that love, however complicated and imperfect, could survive conditions designed to make it impossible. There is a house in Philadelphia that still stands on the street where Samuel and Eleanor raised their children. It has been renovated many times. Different families have lived there over the decades. None of them know the history of what happened within those walls. None of them know about the blacksmith who escaped from South Carolina, or the widow who defied an entire society, or the children who grew up to change the world in small but measurable ways. But the story survives in other forms. In the memoir, Josephine wrote in the sermons Thomas preached in the descendants who carry DNA that connects them to a plantation in Charleston and a forge where iron was bent into new shapes. The story survives because Eleanor was right. The truth matters. Where we come from shapes who we can become. And the impossible families created in the darkness of slavery are part of the American story, whether the country wants to acknowledge them or not. This was Magnolia Grove. This was Ellena Ortega and Samuel. This was a love that broke every rule and paid every price, and somehow against all odds survived, not intact, not undamaged, but survived. In the children who reached Philadelphia, in the grandchildren who fought in the Civil War, in the great-grandchildren who marched for civil rights a century later, in every generation that carried the memory forward, refusing to let it disappear. The plantation is gone now. The land was subdivided and sold and resold until nothing remained of the original Ortega estate. The slave quarters were torn down. The main house burned in a fire in 1891. The magnolia trees were cut down to make room for development. But if you go to that spot outside Charleston today, if you stand on the ground where the blacksmith shed once stood, you can still feel something, a vibration in the air, a weight in the silence, the echo of hammer on anvil, the whisper of voices that refuse to be silenced. Some stories do not end. They transform. They become part of the people who hear them. They shape how we understand ourselves and our history and our capacity for both cruelty and love. The story of Eleanor and Samuel is one of those stories. It asks us to consider what we would do in impossible circumstances. It asks us to examine the rules we accept without question. It asks us to imagine a different world, one where love is not a crime and families are not property, and human beings are valued for their humanity rather than their usefulness. We are still building that world. We are still failing to build it. We are still trying. And somewhere in the archives of Philadelphia, in a box that no one has opened in decades, there is a letter. It is dated 1847. It is written in a woman's careful handwriting. It is addressed to a child she never got to hold. A child who was taken from her after 6 hours, a child named Samuel in her heart. The letter says everything a mother wants to say to her son. It says, I love you. It says, I am sorry. It says, I hope you find happiness wherever you are. It says, I will never stop looking for you. The child never received the letter. The child probably never knew it existed, but the letter exists. The words exist. The love exists. And in some way that defies logic and time, that is enough. It has to be enough. Because sometimes in history, as in life, survival is all we can offer. And survival, as Ellena Ortega learned in a prison cell in South Carolina and a row house in Philadelphia, is its own form of victory. This is how the story ends. Not with triumph, not with tragedy, with survival. With the stubborn persistence of love across generations and borders and all the barriers that human beings build to separate themselves from each other, with children who grew up free because their parents refused to accept that freedom was impossible, with a family that should not have existed existing anyway. That is the lesson of Magnolia Grove. That is the truth Ellena wanted her descendants to remember. Love survives even when everything is designed to destroy it. Even when the law says it cannot exist. Even when the